Broke, I'm hungry, ragged and dirty too. Broke, I'm hungry, ragged and dirty too. Most days I would say I don't, really as anything. The idea that somebody knows exactly what they are, you know, what their gender is or how they're really feeling like that. You know, I think that's something that I never know how to say to people. I just try to roll with it and be like, no, yeah, of course I know who I am, but I don't. But I think as time has come, you know, gone on, that it becomes more just like, this feels right now, you know? At that moment it feels right. It feels almost like very warm to me. There's this warmth to it and this like, it feels different to be in my body when I'm like that. It's just a different experience. It feels great. I didn't know what it was or what was going on when I first started cross-dressing. It took hold of me. I couldn't put it into a box of understanding because I had never seen it before and I didn't know why I was doing things or what I was doing, but like I was doing it. I think one thing that surprised me is how not figured out I have it. And I think people expect me, you know, if I'm dressed as a woman, people are like, oh, you have it figured out. Like, what are your pronouns? Like, you know, what do you identify as? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure, ever. I learned that deep down, there really isn't that much of a difference. And I think I'd always thought there was such a big difference. But I feel like it's just a different way of expressing the same thing.
Because I feel like if feminine is defined as being like opposite masculine, then a transgression of those boundaries would weaken the like thatness or the thisness of either one of those things.
I actually remember being like really young, maybe like 4 years old, and trying on part of a Halloween costume that was like more feminine and just feeling like I was hit by like lightning. And I had no idea what it meant, but I felt immediately ashamed about it. I didn't know how to make sense of it. I think I didn't have an experience like that for several years after that. But I do remember that. Probably one of my earliest memories. There were some moments in childhood where people would be like discussing women's clothing and I'd be really interested. And I didn't know why. I never had that aha moment. It took me until I was a lot older. As I started to learn more about myself, I was like, all right, what the hell am I? And then you figure out what the hell you are, kind of. And then you're like, why did it take me so long to figure out what I am? And then you ask the question of, are there other people like me? And then you realize there are other people like you. And then you're like, were there other people like me? And then if you go down that rabbit hole, you find this really actually uncomfortable truth, which is that Western culture specifically stamped out all these cultures' traditions of having like third or fourth or fifth gender roles. So it was a tradition that was eradicated intentionally across the world. But when you look into it, all these traditions from across the world have this commonality, which is that this third gender role, or however many they had, was usually a shamanistic role or a healing role. And everybody in those societies wasn't necessarily a healer. You know, people had different roles, some people did specific crafts. But if you were queer, and they didn't think of it like that, but if you were queer, then you were a shaman. And these are in tribes like ranging from Africa to all over America. And these cultures hadn't interacted with each other in like thousands of years, right? Which means they all independently concluded that like this type of person, if you can call it a type of person, is equipped for some reason to perform this spiritual role. If that were true, then those types of people would find themselves into a similar role in our society, right? And then I thought about it, and I thought about what's the equivalent of a healer in our society, and it's probably a musician or a performer or an artist. And like, yeah, there are a lot of fucking queer artists. You know, like, look at Patti Smith or Robert Plant or like David Bowie, you know, or even the Beatles in the 70s. Everybody's challenging. You can tell that these people are closer to the center with their genders. You know, they're not like men or like woman. They're like they're both, or they're neither, or they're outside of that whole spectrum. And that's really common in the arts. Maybe genderqueer people have an ability, some sort of ability to see things from both perspectives, or see beyond duality, and to see the truth in some unique way. can say, I want to be this type of person, but yourself isn't something you have control over necessarily, and yourself might actually go that way. Yeah. And you might be wanting to be here and then over here in reality. Yeah. There's this image of what we want ourselves to be, and then there's the self and what it wants to be, and nobody knows that until it's there, until we are there at that moment. And so it's hard to build yourself as a concept. I think the self is something that is like forming right now, like in this question, like, or in this interview, like it's forming. It's not crystallized. And I don't know where it's going to be like 10 seconds from now. Yeah. It could be there. It could be there. Is it us in the context of society? Is it us in the context of the spiritual world? I wish I knew that. I don't know. I'm not like this nebulous concept that nobody's ever heard of before. There are people who have this label and they share that with me. And that helps me understand my role. I feel like as a woman, I'm more able to relax into the circumstances and not try to control things as much. I think it's because there's this subconscious thing that like, oh, like I'm like dainty and like I'm not gonna try to control the situation, So I don't know where that comes from, but that's interesting. Part of my discovery process was figuring out the fact that I have my own womanhood, and also that how I have to shift my perspective to accommodate that, away from whatever I was taught. Because how could I have this part of myself that I thought was different than or less than? And I couldn't. I realized I couldn't. So I think my views of womanhood have become a lot more positive as I've accepted my views of humanhood. I think the biggest thing is just learning how to be myself in that, Something very subtle changed. I don't know what it was. Kind of like a key turning a lock somewhere deep inside. You don't really know what it's locked to, always. Embracing womanhood it put me in my body. It made me feel like it made me feel in my body, and I don't know how else to explain that. But my music changed when I started doing it. I feel like it just opened up. It saw things from a bigger perspective, or a different perspective. When you hear him sing, there's a gentleness to it, there's a femininity to it. And I think that's what makes him so good, is that he's not like seeing it from that side or this side. He's just like both at once. And you feel his voice that's everywhere at once too. As I got more in touch with that, my music became more open and more free and more gentle, I would say. And more balanced. Oh my God, you guys. I know, we're like literally, can you yell at them for me? Like, you're the director, right? Broke, I'm hungry, ragged and dirty too. Broke, I'm hungry, ragged and dirty too. If I clean up, sweet mama, can I spend the night with you? Don't show this to my mom.